I first learned about this back in May of 2013 when Ms. Lerner came out and essentially apologized, said it was inappropriate, and made comments to that regard. And so I think regardless of the original motives, and I think that's what we're still trying to determine is how all this happened, who put these things out, and the motivations. Let's talk about what's happened since then. And we're going to go back and relitigate who did what, and we have to continue to do that. But let's, in this moment, I at least want to move forward a bit and say, what are we doing to ensure that this doesn't happen again? We have talked about the 9 recommendations and their implementation. You've, in your testimony, both written and to Chairman's question, has stated they're following the 9 recommendations. I'd like to talk about the 501c4 rules that are now being proposed. There's going to be legislation before the House on this. They are, interestingly, this has become a bipartisan moment of condemnation. You have the ACLU arguing that these are essentially putting a muzzle on public speech, and you have some liberal and conservative groups doing this. I guess one, I'd like to know, are the 501c4 rules that the IRS is proposing, are those the result of your recommendations? And if not, where are they coming from?
One of the proposed recommendations did come directly from our audit report on inappropriate treatment of groups. And that was, we proposed that there would be the guidance on how one should measure the primary activity of a 501c4. All of the other provisions within the proposed rule, we have had no role in developing, sir.
And as these rules are developed, is it your opinion that the Treasury Department can finalize an IRS rule without the approval of the IRS Commissioner?
I am not privy to the procedures that the IRS follows, or rather that the Treasury Department follows, except to say that for over 50 years, there have been guidance or a directive issued by the Secretary of the Treasury, who has deemed that it is the Assistant Secretary of Treasury for Tax Policy who has the ability to determine the final position of the Department of the Treasury as it relates to Internal Revenue Code or tax policy. And so I would have to defer to them in response to that question.
So you're not aware of an instance where the Treasury Secretary would make a rule or regulation in this regard without the consent or the participation of the IRS Commissioner?
As I've never been a part of that, I can't definitively state it, but one can assume that he or she would seek guidance from the Commissioner.
Sir, the current proposed rules are submitted under the signature of the Deputy Commissioner of Enforcement Services and Enforcement in the IRS. So I haven't, I don't know who signs the final rules, but that is what the proposed rules are signed by.
Regarding, sir, your recommendations on how to fix this problem, do you believe if the IRS follows the recommendations of the Inspector General that Congress could sleep at night, they could be rest assured, that the American people could be rest assured and sleep at night knowing that there is no possibility that agents within the IRS could utilize ideology or some other perspective that goes against their mandate that would target individuals in any way, both as individuals for audits or groups for audits? How ironclad are these reforms and these changes to ensure? Because, sir, it's not just on this issue. We have people, essentially there is a chilling effect across the country now of fear of individuals that if they even got involved politically and endorsed Mr. Serrano or the chairman or me or made a donation, that now they're on a list. And that means maybe not today, but some other administration might utilize the subjective powers that exist that human individuals have that can be riddled with fraud or error or malfeasance. They could use that to subject them to an audit in the future, and now they have to worry every time they get one. Why are they getting an audit? How do we fix that?
Well, allow me to answer your question, Congressman, by saying, we're dealing with human beings.
Right.
And so we still officially have not had a chance to take a formal review of the implementation that the IRS says it has adopted, and we're going to go one by one through each one to determine to what extent they have complied with what we recommended and any ways that they may have diverted, improved, or not met up to that recommendation. But this is somewhat of an aside, but it is a ironclad rule that IRS employees are not supposed to access the tax return information of people that they officially have no responsibility to work on that particular case. And yet, on a daily basis, they do that, some of them. Not a lot, but some of them do. So you can have the most ironclad rule in place, but you're dealing with human beings who are imperfect or do it.
Well, and I think this is why a lot of Americans are concerned about the IRS getting involved in their health care decisions and determining whether they have the proper health insurance to meet federal mandates, and having that sort of relationship that they might think of with their doctor or someone else in the healthcare world now with an IRS agent, I think scares a lot of people that this agency has become too powerful and it has too many opportunities to commit these types of anti-freedom, anti-American type of actions. And so we're going to continue, hopefully in a bipartisan way. I know my colleagues on both sides of the aisle are concerned about this because it can happen as easily to a conservative group as a liberal group or a group based upon religion or race or anything. And so we've got to root this out no matter where we are and make sure this doesn't ever happen again, and that people don't feel like it could happen. And so your recommendations are an important part of that, and we'll look to move forward on additional recommendations as we try to fix this problem. The second topic is one in which has come up today, both in the Commissioner's hearing and your hearing, is what's the IRS doing to ensure that it has better resources to deal with taxpayer concerns and complaints, to ensure that the phone's being picked up. The chairman made that comment. Others have made the comment regarding your data that it's not being, the responses are pretty weak in terms of handling concerns for consumers. I guess I would like to maybe turn this question a little bit in that, is the problem that we have not enough people to answer all of the questions and concerns that taxpayers have, or is the problem that the code is so cumbersome and riddled with exemptions and loopholes and problems that average everyday working Americans couldn't possibly attempt to figure out on their own, as they have to hire accountants and lawyers, and we've got 4 million words in this code, and it grows by the second with the regulatory side as well. I guess, is the problem that we need more people to answer the problems Americans have with the code, or is the problem in the code itself?
Yes. It's all of the above, Congressman. And I'll defer to Ms. Olson in a moment, but it's a zero-sum game here. Mm-hmm. I mean, they have a finite amount of resources. They have to make sure that the American people understand how to comply with the tax code. It has been my belief and findings of many of our audit reports that if people understand what the rules are, if the IRS, and this is a key component, and I alluded to this in the testimony, had access to third-party information about the income of people who have tax reporting obligations, that increases dramatically the compliance rate. I use this figure, and I believe I have in previous testimonies before this committee, but it's so important that I feel I have to repeat this. Again, it's a high correlation between tax compliance and third-party information reporting and withholding. The IRS itself estimates that individuals whose wages are subject to withholding report 99% of their wages for tax purposes. Self-employed individuals who operate non-farm businesses are estimated to report only 44% of their income for tax purposes. And the most striking figure, and while it is dated, it's the most up-to-date information that we have, self-employed individuals Operating businesses on a cash basis report just 19% of their income for tax purposes. So if the IRS had the ability to gain more information from third parties to attest to the income of the taxpayer, you would have a massive positive impact on reducing the tax gap and increasing the revenue that is due to the federal government. I want to leave enough time for Ms. Olson to respond, but you have to have enforcement. That's the second aspect of it. So the IRS has to be in a position, and whether it's by correspondence audit, most people don't realize that if they receive a letter from the IRS questioning their income tax or their tax return, that's an audit. So an audit is not just some IRS person coming to your office or your home and sitting across from you and going line by line through, receipts and what have you. So, and also a telephone call from the IRS making the same inquiries. That's an audit. So if you don't have those individuals in a position to do that, and most people who are contacted by the IRS do respond. So if they had more resources, more people to be able to do that, I think it would have a very beneficial impact on revenue collection. But
Ms. Olson.
If I think there are a number of things operating here. One is the sheer volume of the work that the IRS has undertaken. Just even its core work has increased dramatically in the last 10 years. The number of phone calls we've received has increased by 53% between fiscal year 2004 and this last fiscal year. So just the volume, our taxpayer service budget hasn't increased that much to be able to meet the demand that taxpayers have. In terms of what the IRS could do to move things get savings in one place and move them to these taxpayer service needs, I think you have to look at the appropriations format itself. We have the two categories of service and enforcement, and then a number of others like IT. And it's very difficult to move dollars between those two. And in the taxpayer service category is essentially the filing season. So all of those 150 million individual returns and 10 million business returns have to be processed. And that's the big chunk of the taxpayer service budget. And what's ever left over is for the phones. And in fact, this last year, because the IRS, one of the reasons why the IRS was able to get its phone level of service even up to the abysmal level of service that it was by taking people off of answering the phones for the automated collection system, where taxpayers were calling in to say, we'd like to pay you money. We took them off of that system and put them on the regular 1040 line just to answer the calls during the filing season. If we hadn't done that, we would have been in much worse shape during the filing season. I think that there are lots of things that the IRS does. I mean, I write a 500, 700-page report every year identifying things that the IRS could do better. And I think one of the things that I spend a lot of time with, and I would encourage this committee to really urge the IRS to look at, is the work that they do up front that creates downstream consequences, that because they're not addressing issues correctly up front or resolving the whole issue up front, you're having many more touches downstream, and that wastes resources, and often those downstream resources are higher graded employees than the person at the first line of contact. And we've done a number of studies actually tracing things through the process to show, what work is generated by not getting that right answer up front. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done in that area. And I think that there's some looking at what are we categorizing as enforcement versus service. Do we have the right allocations between the budget categories and things like that? But the bottom line is the amount of work. Leave aside Affordable Care Act, leave aside anything, that's new, just the volume of returns that are coming in. And I'd say one last point. After this recession, we're seeing more and more people becoming self-employed. They're not being hired back as wage earners. They're either putting themselves into business. And so that issue of, unincorporated self-employed people not reporting becomes a larger issue for our tax gap and our business going forward. There's a huge taxpayer service side on that component too, educating people, being out there, talking to them about their responsibilities, et cetera. It's not just all enforcement that brings in compliance.
Well, I appreciate both of your comments on that topic, and it's one that requires a lot of study and certainly changes from Congress. I would say, Ms. Olson, the biggest upstream factor of all this is, you mentioned dealing with problems upstream and not letting them continue to have to cause problems down the road and have more individuals have to touch it, more staff have to deal with it. The biggest upstream issue, I think, is the complexity of the tax code. Mm-hmm. If we had a simplified tax code, one in which taxpayers knew the obligations they had, they were very clear and easy to, it would be not only easy for taxpayers, it'd be so much easier on the enforcement side. It would require less people, it would require a smaller budget for the IRS. And so I don't think you're going to see a lot of us say, the answer for tax complexity is we just need more staff. We need more bureaucrats. That's not going to be the angle I think we're going to take, is how do we simplify the code to make it easier on taxpayers and easier to enforce? Mr. George.
Mr. Yoder, because Ms. Olson raised a very important point, and I don't know whether or not this was going to come up later, but one of the unintended consequences of the IRS having to shift people from one function to answer telephone calls, one of the areas in which they do this is especially troubling because they take people who were working identity theft cases, who are working to help identity theft victims, and literally having these individuals stop in midstream and move to telephone answering, how do you complete a return and what have you, and which causes immense delays in helping victims of identity theft, which, as members of this committee know, is a massively growing problem, and especially if you're the subject, if you're the victim involved, is very frustrating. And so it's just a point, again, it's a zero-sum game. They need resources to do it all. This ACA role, most Americans have no idea of the massive role that the IRS is going to play in the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. And the IRS, once again, will have to make some tough choices as to what to focus upon.
Thank you. I don't have any